Hi, this is Mike Heumann of G2M Research, and we're doing one of our enterprise storage interviews. Today with me is Josh Goldenhar from Lightbits Labs.
Hi, Mike. Thanks very much.
Hey, how's it going, Josh? The first time I ever heard about Lightbits Labs is really about your NVMe over TCP driver. You seem now to be focused on what we call, at least at G2M Research, scale-out flash storage. Is this really a pivot for Lightbits, or is this kind of the planned approach from the beginning?
Hey, Mike, that's a great question. Thanks very much. We are known in the industry as the NVMe over TCP folks, but this is not a pivot. It was always the plan to do a storage solution. And the way it really started is that we have founders, very lucky to have in this company, very talented founders who have a belief in standards-based software and the way things, quote unquote, should be. So we have folks that developed the very first controllers for NVMe devices for PCIe switching. And then, of course, we have our CTO who's been on the NVMe.org or NVMeExpress.org panels and helped not only to develop the standards that became NVMe over Fabric, but actually contribute code. And this came from the fact that people were gravitating towards RDMA, because if you're using NVMe, it's very, very low latency. So of course, the thought is let's keep that latency as low as possible when we use it remotely. And RDMA comes to mind as being extremely low latency. But as we all know, RDMA also comes with some baggage. There's limited selection in NICs. They're not proprietary NICs, but there's a very, very limited selection of NICs that support RDMA. Then you have to include drivers, specialized drivers, OFED drivers, which are kernel sensitive. They're kernel modules, so they're sensitive to changes. You have to make changes in your switching. You have to do things that are foreign to everybody who knows how to do TCP/IP. And as we all know in the computer industry, everybody, when they have to learn something new, jumps right in and wants to do that right away. Hopefully everyone knows that's a joke. That people like to do what they're comfortable with, and people are comfortable with TCP. So our founder said, TCP is really the way to go. Ethernet always wins, and by extension, TCP/IP always wins. Because folks don't want to learn something that new, and there's this concept of good enough. If you can make TCP basically very, very close to the performance you get with RDMA, people are generally not going to sweat that last 5 to 10% performance improvement. They're going to go with what they know. It's going to improve operational expense, and so all sorts of methods there, because you don't have to learn things new. You don't have to do different configurations on your switches that are going to support storage versus regular TCP/IP traffic. And so the goal was to get NVMe over TCP standardized, get it in the upstream code so that it's just included, so that there's no driver, and make the whole process as frictionless as possible, so that when we had our NVMe over TCP targets with full failover, with thin provisioning, with a lot compression, a lot of things that people view as a needed in a storage solution, they equate it also with some of the features of legacy storage solutions. When we had all that ready, which we do now, it's all ready to go. It's as frictionless as possible to go ahead and implement and get this really high performance, low latency, high bandwidth scale out flash storage. And so it wasn't a pivot so much, although we do understand that from outside it can be perceived that way.
Well, I think there's certainly the argument to be made as well, and a lot of people on the TCP side of the NVMe over Fabric discussion have put this forward, that once you throw in network congestion and things like that, getting that last 5% is usually incredibly difficult, if not impossible. And in real world scenarios, you're probably looking at the same performance, whether it's RDMA or TCP anyway.
Yeah, very much. And with upcoming developments, there's no announcements yet, but if you look at the work that Intel is pushing with ADQ, ADQ on TCP/IP for certain application streams can bring communication on TCP/IP down to about the same levels latency-wise as RDMA. So I encourage people to also look into Intel and ADQ and map that, if they're thinking about it, to what you could do with NVMe over TCP if that were supported. And if you can bring down the latencies very, very close to, if for all intents and purposes, the same as Rocky on top of Ethernet, and not have to do things like PFC or global pods or ECN, it becomes even more attractive.
Absolutely. So one of the things you talk about a lot on your website is cloud scale data centers, right? So I think we all know that, the values that people like Amazon and, obviously Microsoft Azure and other people like that get out of that. And you guys talk about bringing those same values to normal, I'm going to say normal or mortal data center operators, the guys that aren't, don't have unlimited budgets to spend on their data center storage architecture.
Right.
For that average guy, if you had to tell him, here's the big three things you're going to get out of using a solution like ours, what would those big three things be?
Well, the big three would be efficiencies, and specifically, it's operational efficiency, it's lowered cost, and it's higher performance. So those three things, not necessarily in that order, are higher efficiencies in general, definitely lower cost, but at the same time, higher performance. And to expand on that a bit, what hyperscalers did, and a lot of people think, well, I'm not a hyperscaler. I'm only going to deploy, a couple of racks of systems, not 10,000s or hundreds of thousands of servers. But people do want to get those cost savings, and the way hyperscalers got cost savings, first off, was to normalize configurations. Get them as few as possible. In fact, in a perfect world, they'd have a single server SKU and just have multiples of the servers per rack. Everything would be software defined. You can't necessarily always get there, especially when you factor in that legacy folks don't have just one application. What I mean by that is Facebook, you can think of as one very large software configuration. It's one application. Now, folks will argue with me, of course, it's multiple applications underneath the covers, but Facebook has a singular purpose, which is to bring this application called Facebook to life and service all sorts of folks. So they can design specifically for what they need. They can map hardware directly to software and vice versa. But if you're a legacy environment where you have all sorts of applications from the quote unquote old days you have to support, or you're a service provider, that's not a huge service provider like an Amazon or a Microsoft Azure, but a smaller one where you serve customers and those customers want to run quote unquote anything they want. You just never know what you're going to have. So you need a little more flexibility. So you want to drive down to certain SKUs. Single SKUs reduce your costs because you can buy the same kind of configuration. You can negotiate better prices. Operationally, everything's the same. So you don't have servers that are different than others that need special handling. You want to drive all that down. And of course, scaling. By scaling, you get better TCO. You drive down your costs from your vendors, just being able to negotiate. And the biggest thing is moving from proprietary hardware, especially in the storage case, to commodity or standard servers. So by taking scale out flash storage software and putting it on top of standard servers, the combination together is going to cost you far less than the proprietary hardware you get from the traditional array vendors. And then, so all of this together is going to give you better cost, more efficiency. And lastly, what's kind of funny here is many scale out flash solutions, of course, I'm really focused on ours, are much, much higher performance, as much as 10 to 20 times higher performance. And that same equivalent reduced latency than the competing array solutions, the proprietary array solutions. So not only is it costing less, you're getting higher performance. And at the end of the day, who doesn't really want higher performance? If you're going to have a piece of cake, you could have a bigger piece of cake, and even if you don't eat it all, it's nice to have a bigger piece of cake. So that's basically where we focus there. And you can do this by just buying software and buying servers rather than having to hire thousands or tens of thousands of engineers. That's the key thing here. Cloud scale data centers are definitely on the rise. We see lots of enterprises and innovative enterprise moving towards private cloud in addition to public cloud. We're not saying that people are going to go private instead of public. It's both of these things have a place in the world. And if you look at most of the analysts that have done their predictions, through 2026, things like this, they show enterprise storage, traditional array-based storage, getting a smaller and smaller share of the market. I think even last year it shrunk before the whole COVID crisis. The enterprise storage market shrunk by about 4%, so it's a shrinking market. And what's growing is the hyperscale clouds, the public clouds, but also private clouds. People who want to take advantage of those same kind of processes, efficiencies, cost reductions that the big guys get, but are doing it on their own so that they have control over quality of service, over performance, over latency, and over site costs, and of course over data movement costs. So it's a kind of long answer. Sorry for that.
No, and it's like you said, who doesn't like higher performance at a lower price, right? It's kind of hard to say no to that.
Yep.
So it kind of leads me into my third question. That is, so I think we differentiate you guys from the array guys, and I tend to agree with what you said there. I think the next question would be, how do you differentiate yourself then from the hyperscalers? Public cloud versus private cloud. As you said, I believe this as well. There's a place for both, but are there times where you'd say, or certain use cases where it makes more sense for private, scale out type of architecture as opposed to using public cloud?
Yeah, absolutely. There's various reasons to choose. Let's go with, instead of talking about performance, which we just did, let's just talk about data sensitivity. If you talk about or think about running in the cloud, what you have to factor in immediately is that you don't run anything in the cloud without that running or manipulating data, right? It's very rare that your services are 100% ephemeral. You have to move data. So there's a question on your data sensitivity. Can you even move the data you want to move or utilize in the cloud? And there can be various reasons you have to look at of why you can't do that. They can be legal ones, such as HIPAA requirements, or they can just be sensitivity to IP protection, which is do I really want to put the crown jewels of the company in a public cloud? Now that is becoming less and less of a concern, but we do see data breaches every day. And when you're running in a cloud, the cloud provider may be very secure, but other people's services may not be as secure. It just becomes much more important for you to secure everything, every piece of your application space. So you have to look at the risk reward of moving your data to the cloud up to a place where it is by definition accessible by the world, basically. You have to put the right things in place, but it is accessible. So data sensitivity is very important there. Now let's get to the things that I think people thought I was going to say, the answer to this, and that is performance. When you go to the cloud, if you do need high performance, especially low latency, they're starting to see solutions out there. But generally the solutions fall into the bucket of, well, yeah, you can have local flash, or you can even have local NVMe in your machine instances. And but that by definition is ephemeral. You can't, you can't count on that data being there if the virtual machine instance shuts down or is moved. So there's a problem in that if you want that level of performance, it's actually, in a weird way, it's just like saying, why don't you just use DAS? That's what you're doing. You're using DAS in the cloud. And so it's up to you to replicate it and keep your data safe. If you don't want that, some of the cloud vendors are starting to offer lower latency, high performance flash-based solutions. There's one in particular I'm thinking of that people might know about, but one of the really big cloud providers has a newer offering that is relatively very high performance for a cloud offering, low latency, high numbers of IOPS, and it is very, very expensive. It's so expensive, in fact, that I wonder if it's getting any traction. So you're left with this problem that if low latency is important to you, and you want to be able to maintain a certain level of performance, if you have SLAs to your own internal customers or to external customers, you're probably going to best meet those with a private cloud offering. Lastly, the shine of public cloud is worn off in some areas. We have heard of some companies that have made the move away from private data centers to public cloud, and have found out that they're not saving any money. In fact, if they operate in a way that is efficient, they actually would spend less money by maintaining their own data centers rather than moving to the cloud. Now, there's many factors in that one. Many cloud offerings charge you for data in and data out, or especially for data out. So it doesn't cost you anything to get your data into the cloud, but getting your data out of the cloud can be costly. So you have to look for that. So last, to summarize, you want to look at your data sensitivity on can you move data to the cloud, or do you want to move data to the cloud? You have to look at performance, is if you're going to need high levels of performance, and especially quality of service or consistency of that performance. Most of the vendors do not provide for any kind of consistency guarantee. So if you need consistency or high performance, you probably want to be private versus public. And lastly, you really have to look at the cost model. If the high performance that are offered in the cloud will work for you on paper from a performance standpoint, the question is, how much is that going to cost? It may be less money for you to go ahead and do an efficient private cloud than to do public.
Yeah, and there's certainly been a lot written about the complexities of the cost models of the cloud, and so that makes a lot of sense. I can definitely see that being an issue for a lot of companies.
Unfortunately, for a lot of people, it's so complex because if you forget something, you know your model's wrong, that you often just simply don't find out until 6 months or a year operating in the cloud.
Exactly.
And then the cloud folks, they've got you, right? Because who wants to admit I made a mistake? We need to move everything back. Oh, we sold off the data center. We need to get that back.
So, yeah, that's usually not good for your career in most cases.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
So going back to our earliest question, I mean, I think you obviously address a lot of the things about NVMe over TCP. Do you think there's parts of the market you miss by not supporting other fabric protocols, whether it's InfiniBand or RDMA or Fiber Channel, or do you really see NVMe over TCP eventually becoming the dominant NVMe over fabric protocol?
Mike, that's a very leading question. I like that. Thank you. So, no, but as a marketing as a marketing person, I think one would expect me to simply say, "Oh, of course, NVMe over TCP is the only thing you ever need." And I'll give you kind of a mixed answer to that. One that I hope people find is truthful. Are we missing any significant parts of the market? I think the issue there is drilling down into the word significant. Are we missing parts of the market? Absolutely. There are always people who are going to want the absolute highest performance, and especially in the case of NVMe and NVMe over Fabric, they want the absolute lowest latency. There are people willing to do this. Some of the ones I'm thinking of are, in the financial sector, trades and simulation. There's things in the world that just really rely on the very lowest levels of latency. And there's always going to be that top, I don't know what it is, 5% of the market that is willing to tune every last little knob and get every bit of performance and lower latency as much as possible. So we're not going to hit that market. We're awful close to it, but we are going to miss out on that. So the question really is that definition of significant. Is that a significant part of the market? If it's 5%, some people may view that as significant. But if we can hit the other 95%, that's a really big market for us to go to. If you remember in the beginning of this call, I said we're very fortunate to have some brilliant founders for Lightbits that were heavily involved in the standards for NVMe over Fabric. And when I say that, I don't just mean NVMe over TCP. NVMe over Fabric, originally defined with RDMA, was also both standardized and helped with coding by our founders. So they know RDMA very, very well. I'm not saying that you could see RDMA in our product, but the same folks who brought you Lightbits and NVMe over TCP also were responsible for developing the NVMe over Fabric standard and some of the code on RDMA, so they know that. If we had to, we could probably go there. But do I think that NVMe over TCP is going to win? Absolutely. It's Ethernet over the years, and unfortunately I've been doing this for more years than I want to admit. I saw other networking protocols come and go, Token Ring, City, FIDI. Everybody said they always had a better solution than Ethernet, but Ethernet seems to always win. Ethernet is getting ridiculously fast. We just saw that I think the 800 gigabit standard was just ratified. So 800 gigabit is ratified. It comes with latency reductions. Ethernet today is ridiculously low latency. It's crazy fast. It's crazy amounts of bandwidth. So if you run TCP on top of that, you're getting something you know and love. Everyone knows how to do TCP/IP. It's what the world's data centers and routing and the internet itself is based on TCP/IP. So if you take this by extension, that Ethernet is getting so crazy fast, it's no longer a bottleneck at all. TCP/IP is getting better. There's getting more efficient operations on top of TCP. I mentioned ADQ earlier. So if you do all these things, you simply see that it's just entropy comes in. Is people are just simply, it's human nature. They're not going to want to have to learn something different. Network administrators don't want to have a different switch configuration per switch, which you kind of need to have to support Rocky on Ethernet. And you don't need that necessarily with TCP/IP. So we're seeing great traction in more and more people wanting to do NVMe over TCP this year, and we really think that towards the end of this year and 2021 is going to be when NVMe over TCP really takes off. Legacy protocols like Fiber Channel will be around for a long time because of the amount of equipment that's already deployed. But we do honestly believe that NVMe over TCP will be the protocol that takes over. It will end up replacing anywhere that there's iSCSI. It'll absolutely replace iSCSI because there's simply no reason. On the very same equipment running iSCSI versus running NVMe TCP can do far more IOPS at much lower latency with NVMe over TCP. And you don't have to change anything in the network. So why wouldn't you go forward? So are we missing some of the market? Legacy, that's a greatly shrinking market like Fiber Channel, is going to shrink like crazy. Overall legacy storage, we've already seen it shrinking. The growing market is in the cloud space, as some of your other questions. Cloud scale infrastructure, things going to commodity, things going to storage is going to scale out flash storage. So that's absolutely where we want to go. We want to go towards where the puck is going rather than where it's been.
I think that makes perfect sense. Getting a lot of 95% of the market sounds a lot better than spending, your 50% of your effort chasing the last 5% anyway.
Yes, yes.
So one question that obviously, given today's times, what have you guys seen as from an impact on business or from the COVID pandemic and that sort of thing? Have you seen anything along those lines that's
we've definitely
good, bad, otherwise?
Yeah, we've definitely seen the slowdown, and it wasn't exactly where we at first expected. When COVID seemed to really be impacting the way you do, especially marketing and events, trade shows. It was first evidenced in trade shows being canceled, trade shows that we and other people expected to go to. In fact, yesterday we just got word that VMworld is now canceled as an in-person event, is going to be a virtual event. So you see these massive trade shows where we expected to have presence getting canceled, and marketeers will tell you, oh, that's no big deal, you just move to digital events. And we go like, yeah, we'll move to digital events. And hey, I'm talking to you on something that's a podcast that is a digital event. It doesn't seem revolutionary, as we've been doing podcasts for quite some time, but we'll move to digital. And we thought, okay, we'll do this pivot. What we didn't expect, though, and I was just talking to a customer this morning, is that, hey, when can you get in and do this thing that required a physical reconfiguration of a server? And they said, well, our servers are in a colo, and we're in a state where only essential employees, essential services can go. And this colo, because of security reasons, is considered an essential service. And some of our services running there are also deemed essential, but we can only schedule the tech to go in a certain window. So in other words, he's saying his guy who used to just be able to go in the data center whenever he wanted to has to say, oh, I want to go in at 4 p.m. on Thursday and I will be there from 4 to 5. And anybody who's worked in computers should well know that the best laid plans simply don't work out. So if you only have a window from 4 to 5, it's very tough. So what we're seeing is that at the end of the day, we're talking about software on top of hardware. And hardware needs configuration. If nothing else, someone has to insert the NVMe drives into the hosts and connect cables and stuff. And we're having difficulty in people being able to do the POCs and test the software, not because it's not remote installable. If you have all your systems set up, you can take Lightbits and install it, in minutes, and get up and going. But if you don't have all the cables connected, or the drives installed, or you had to put in a PCIe card, that's where we're seeing a big impact. People are literally just not in the office. They're not in their labs. They're not in their colos, and hence we're seeing some slowdown there in people being able to execute on POCs. We're doing the digital marketing and digital meetings and still talking to prospects, but when it comes down to the next step of, cool, you want to try this? And they're like, yeah, we'd love to try it as soon as we can get into our lab, and that's where we're seeing the issue.
It's interesting. That certainly probably is not one that people thought would be important, but yeah, I can see how that definitely will be impacting people left and right. That's a good point. So assuming we get past all this stuff, what do you guys see as the biggest challenges for Lightbits as you try to scale your company in the future?
So I alluded to it a bit in one of your previous questions, and that is basically waiting for NVMe over TCP to be really accepted. So NVMe over TCP is in the Linux kernel as of the 4.18 kernel, which to some people will sound like ancient history because we're well into the 5.x range for Linux kernels. But most folks do run an enterprise-based Linux, whether they're actually buying it from Red Hat or if they're using CentOS or if they're using the Ubuntu long-term releases. These releases tend to use older kernels and backport patches. So for example, with Lightbits, if you run Red Hat 8.1 and above, you have everything you need to do on the clients without installing any software from us to access NVMe over TCP, including multipath ability. It's great. But then how many people are running Red Hat 8.1? So there's this, and for folks that are not running that, the drivers are open source. You could build them yourselves, or of course we'll build them for you. But the point is more that people just want to really open the box and have it work. And if you're running one of these enterprise releases, the newer enterprise releases have everything in them, but not everyone is up there yet. Tons of people are still running Red Hat 7.x. We've even hit customers that are still running Red Hat 6.8, if you can believe that. So people tend not to move forward unless they really have to. So staying relevant, getting enough activity is what we have to do in the meantime. Establishing the right partnerships is what we're doing until we really see things take off, which COVID has put a dent in that, absolutely. But barring that, we do believe that later this year will become more and more accepted. As people move to the newer releases, they'll have all the software they need. As people get more comfortable that this standard is not only available, but supported by more vendors, right? You never want to be in the pool by yourself. It's more fun to have other people with you in the pool. So we're seeing more folks come out with NVMe over TCP as a supported protocol, and that lends itself to more credibility. So the challenge is simply to hang on. And sometimes being first is hard, so you have to run your business in a very efficient manner, in a very smart way, to hang in there until it comes around, until it being acceptance in the market. And we do think that's going to happen late this year and throughout next year.
No, it makes perfect sense. Any hosts from Microsoft adopting NVMe over TCP as part of their standard distributions?
Well, we certainly hope so. I think let's put it this way. Microsoft has such an immensely complex matrix to support. When you think about how far back in hardware Microsoft
Absolutely.
has to run in, and then all the different software pieces that they have to work with. If I were Microsoft, I would be hesitant to add yet another protocol as well. But as I said earlier, any place that you can run iSCSI as an initiator, you could run NVMe over TCP. And so there's really not a good reason not to go other than it complicates your matrix, and hence you don't want to go there until you have to. So do I think Microsoft will eventually do it? Absolutely. When? I don't know. And I certainly hope it's sooner than later. But Linux is right there. And if we talk about Microsoft from the view of Azure, I think someone could always call in or write in or post a comment on this. Of course, they can't call in. I don't know where that came from. But to say if I'm right or wrong, but I think most of the instances running in Azure are still Linux-based. So you could be running on a Microsoft hypervisor, Hyper-V, running Linux instances.
Absolutely.
And those Linux instances can run NVMe over TCP. And we do have, we have plans to also have our software available as a cloud offering. Because we don't require RDMA, we can run it in the cloud. We just need systems and NVMe and TCP, and then we could take those ephemeral drives that I talked about earlier. If someone in Azure or in AWS offered virtual machine instances that had NVMe, which is ephemeral, we could tie those together and have a more reliable storage service. So again, not making any product announcement here, but you can think about the fact that because we're just software and we don't require special hardware like RDMA NICs or a special protocol, we could run basically anywhere. So I certainly hope that folks will adopt this large web services, will think about it. As far as Microsoft as a product, like on your desktop in the data center, I hope they'll adopt that soon. And of course, I hope the same thing for giants like VMware, that they'll see the light
Absolutely.
on NVMe over TCP.
You'd certainly think so.
Yes.
Well, Josh, it's been great talking to you, and I really appreciate it. And look forward to talking more with you later. Thank you.
All right. Thanks much, Mike. Take care.